Did you know that there are some countries where Americans are simply not welcome anymore? Despite all the influence and help the US has given globally, some places just don't want American visitors. It's crazy to think about it, right? In today's video, we're going to dive deep into the reasons behind this and uncover the 10 countries that no longer allow Americans. Before we get into it, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates from our channel. And stay tuned till the end to get the full picture of why these countries have turned hostile toward American travelers. Number 10. Cuba. Let's kick off with Cuba. The US has had a complicated relationship with this island nation for decades, mainly because of the long-standing embargo. Even though things have gotten a little better in terms of diplomatic relations, travel for tourism is still a big no-go for Americans. You can't just hop on a plane and head to Cuba for a vacation like you can with most other countries. Instead, you have to fit into one of 12 specific travel categories, like visiting family, doing journalistic work, or educational purposes. And here's where it gets even trickier. To visit Cuba, Americans need a visa, but it's not a simple process. There's no Cuban embassy in the US, so you'll have to go through a third country's embassy just to get one. This makes planning a trip not only a hassle, but also more expensive and time-consuming. Plus, the rules about travel are constantly changing, leaving travelers confused about what's allowed. Even if you manage to get your visa and follow all the steps, there's still extra scrutiny. You have to prove why you're going and that your trip fits into one of those approved categories, making the whole thing feel like jumping through endless hoops. Number 9. Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has been opening up to tourists in recent years, allowing travelers to explore its stunning deserts, historic sites, and unique culture. But for Americans, especially women, traveling here comes with its own set of rules and challenges. Women under 25 can't travel alone. They need a male family member to accompany them. Even though the country has relaxed some of its rules, you still have to dress modestly. That means covering your shoulders and knees in public. It's a culture shock for many, but also a fascinating look into a society deeply rooted in Islamic traditions. For American tourists, the strict cultural rules around behavior, dress, and how men and women interact can feel restrictive. But on the flip side, it's an opportunity to experience a culture that's very different from what most are used to. It's definitely not your typical vacation spot, and for some, that's the appeal. However, be prepared for some serious culture adjustment if you decide to visit. Number 8. Iran. Iran is a country rich in history, culture, and beauty, but unfortunately, strained relations between the US and Iran make it a difficult destination for American travelers. Since the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the relationship between the two countries has been rocky, and that means strict travel restrictions are in place. For starters, you can't just wander around Iran on your own. All American visitors have to join an organized tour with a government-approved guide, which means you're not free to explore independently. You'll follow a preset itinerary, which can feel pretty limiting if you prefer to travel on your own terms. Then there's the visa process, which is notorious for being long, complicated, and frustrating. To get a visa, Americans have to get an authorization code through an Iranian travel agency first, and that's just the beginning of the paperwork. It's not a quick or easy process, and even after all that effort, there's no guarantee that your visa will be approved. All these hurdles make Iran one of the most challenging countries for Americans to visit, even though it's an incredible place to explore. Number 7. Bhutan. Bhutan is often called the land of the thunder dragon, and it's one of the most peaceful and stunningly beautiful countries in the world. But if you're an American hoping to visit, be prepared for some serious planning and hefty costs. Bhutan isn't exactly easy on the wallet. In fact, it has a policy that keeps the number of visitors low by charging a daily fee of up to $250. While that sounds steep, it does include your accommodation, meals, and even a sustainable tourism royalty, which helps Bhutan preserve its environment and cultural heritage. But that price tag means spontaneous. Budget travel isn't an option here. To get a visa, you'll have to book through a licensed Bhutanese tour operator, which locks you into a structured itinerary. Independent travel is off the table, but on the bright side, this setup ensures a carefully curated and immersive experience. You'll get expert guides who provide deep insights into Bhutan's rich traditions and breathtaking landscapes, making sure you walk away with a meaningful experience, even if it lacks a bit of freedom. Number 6. Russia. Russia is a country full of history, art, and sprawling landscapes, but recent years have made it a tricky spot for American travelers. Getting a visa to Russia is no walk in the park. The process is notoriously tough, requiring mountains of paperwork that detail everything from your work history to your educational background. And even if you get through the bureaucratic maze, there's no guarantee your visa will be approved. What makes it worse is the high-level travel advisory from the US government. Political tensions, especially with the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, mean that the relationship between Russia and the US is at an all-time low. American visitors might face harassment from officials, and the threat of arbitrary law enforcement is real. Some regions are considered particularly dangerous, with warnings about terrorism and crime. For anyone thinking about visiting Russia, it's not just about the complicated visa process. You're also stepping into a politically tense environment where being an American could make you a target. It's a risk that most travelers aren't willing to take right now. Number 5. Syria. Syria, once known for its incredible ancient ruins and rich history, has sadly become one of the most dangerous places in the world. The country has been ravaged by a brutal civil war since 2011, making it completely unsafe for American tourists. Or really, tourists of any nationality. The US Department of State has a strong advisory against all travel to Syria, and it's not hard to see why. The risk of terrorism, kidnapping, and armed conflict is extremely high. Even if you somehow manage to secure a visa through a third country, since there's no Syrian embassy in the US, the logistics of traveling in Syria are near impossible. The conflict has destroyed much of the infrastructure, and many of the once famous historical sites are either heavily damaged or entirely inaccessible. For Americans, the biggest risk is being caught in the violence, or worse, targeted for kidnapping by extremist groups. It's one of those places that was once a dream destination for history lovers, but is now completely off-limit. Number 4. North Korea. North Korea is probably one of the most infamous destinations on this list, and for good reason. Americans are completely banned from visiting, except in very rare circumstances like journalism or humanitarian work, and that only happens with special approval from the US Department of State. The ban was put in place during the Trump administration due to the extreme risks involved in traveling there, and it's still in effect today. Before the ban, Americans could visit North Korea under strict conditions. All tourists had to join an organized tour and were accompanied by government guides at all times. You couldn't just wander around and explore the country freely. Everything was tightly controlled to present a carefully curated image of North Korea, leaving no room for genuine interaction with locals. But even under those circumstances, the risks were high. The case of Otto Warmbier, an American student who was arrested and later died after being detained, highlighted just how dangerous it could be for foreigners in North Korea. The regime has a history of using detained tourists as political pawns, making it a place where even the thought of visiting can send shivers down your spine. Number 3. Venezuela. Venezuela was once a vibrant and popular destination known for its stunning landscapes and rich culture. But today, it's one of the most dangerous places for American travelers. The country has been in a political and economic crisis for years, and the US government strongly advises against traveling there due to the numerous risks. One of the biggest dangers for tourists is the high crime rate. Violent crime, including armed robbery, kidnapping, and even homicide, is widespread. The country's economic collapse has made daily life extremely difficult for locals, and foreigners, especially Americans, are often targeted for both financial and political reasons. The political situation between the US and Venezuela is also very tense. American tourists risk being arbitrarily detained, with some US citizens even being held without clear reasons. These detentions can drag on for months, and that uncertainty, combined with the dangerous environment, makes Venezuela a no-go for most travelers. On top of that, the visa process is a headache. Since Venezuela doesn't have an embassy in the US anymore, Americans have to apply for a visa through a third country. This extra step just adds to the frustration, making travel plans even more complicated. Given the lack of infrastructure and essential services like healthcare, it's hard to imagine anyone feeling safe or comfortable visiting Venezuela anytime soon. Number 2. Libya. Libya used to have a rich history and a growing tourism industry, but now it's one of the most dangerous places for Americans due to the ongoing civil war. Since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, the country has been torn apart by violent conflict, and it's no longer a safe place to visit. The civil war has created a chaotic and lawless environment where armed groups are constantly fighting for control. This means that violence, crime, and terrorism are rampant, and the risks for tourists are extremely high. Terrorist groups have taken advantage of the instability, and attacks can happen without warning, often targeting public places or foreigners. For American travelers, the risks are even higher. Kidnappings, armed robberies, and terrorist attacks are just some of the dangers you could face. There's also the possibility of getting caught in crossfire during clashes between rival factions. The US government strongly advises against all travel to Libya, and given the severe risks, most people aren't even thinking about visiting. Even if you're traveling for business, getting a visa is difficult. The process is restrictive, and only business visas are available for Americans right now. Plus, the ongoing war means that the security situation can change at any moment, making travel incredibly unpredictable. Number 1. Yemen. Yemen, once known for its beautiful architecture and rich cultural heritage, has become one of the most dangerous places in the world due to its devastating civil war. The conflict, which began in 2014, has torn the country apart, and it's now a high-risk area for any traveler, especially Americans. The U.S. government has issued a strong warning against all travel to Yemen, and for good reason. The country is plagued by violence, with ongoing armed clashes between different factions. Terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have established a strong presence in Yemen, making the risks of terrorism and kidnapping extremely high. For American tourists, the threat of being kidnapped is especially worrying. Both terrorist groups and criminal gangs are known to target foreigners, often holding them for ransom or using them for political leverage. The chances of getting caught up in a dangerous situation are alarmingly high, and if something goes wrong, the outcome can be grim. On top of that, Yemen's infrastructure has been devastated by the war. Basic services like healthcare, food, and water are in short supply, making it nearly impossible to ensure safety or comfort during a visit. With the country's chaotic security situation, traveling to Yemen is simply not worth the risk. And that wraps up the list. It's shocking to see how some of these places, once beautiful and culturally rich, are now incredibly dangerous for Americans. What do you think about these countries? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more updates. See you next time.